Good evening. I'm Major Nigel Bovey. I'm the Vice Chair of the Christian Evidence Society. Very welcome to Questions of Our Times. Now, on a day when racism is front page news, our question is which lives matter? My guest today was born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica. In 1960, he moved to London and, liking it so much, has lived there ever since. For 11 years, he was General Director of the Evangelical Alliance, and as such was the spokesperson for the UK's 1 million evangelical Christians. In 2019, he became International Director of Micah Challenge, a global network of Christians responding to the needs of extreme poverty. He has served as a commissioner on the Equality and Human Rights Commission. From 2015 to 2017, he was head of advocacy at Christian Solidarity Worldwide, an organisation that fights for religious freedom and human rights. In the Queen's Birthday Honours of 2019, for services to tackling poverty and injustice, he was appointed Commander of the British Empire. Since then, he has completed a doctorate in the freedom of religion and belief. Currently, he is on the team of the International Institute for Religious Freedom. My guest is in great demand as a writer, a broadcaster, and a speaker. And so to talk with me today about racial equality and racial injustice is the Reverend Dr. Joel Edwards, CBE. Joel, hello. Welcome. It's wonderful to see you.
Hi, thanks very much, Nigel. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Good. Joel, before we start, and there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of days, particularly about racism and hints about language. I mean, one tabloid today had a headline about being toxic and inflammatory. Before we start, can we just talk about language and the right vocabulary that we can use, or I particularly can use when we talk about racism? What kind of words and descriptions are you personally comfortable with?
Well, Nigel, I'm very comfortable with a range of words, because words around the issue of racial justice and race has been so transient over the last decade or so. I think we can all agree that the one word we don't use is the big N word. BAME, people of color, Black nation, all of these, I think, are variants which change and transpose. So I'm comfortable with any of those languages, with those definitions, even though I don't particularly like any of them.
Okay. You don't like any of them, but that just goes to show you can't please any of the people at the time.
Exactly, yeah. They always seem to be in opposition to whiteness. So whatever the language you use, it means not white. So there's always going to be a deficit, I think, in any language you use for people from minority status.
Okay. From Kingston, Jamaica, to somewhere closer to Kingston upon Thames, what was your first impression of England when you came as a lad?
Oh, wow. So now we're going back to May 1960, and very, very typical of a lot of folk who came from the Caribbean and elsewhere back then. If you're a kid, you will have possibly received postcards from your parents in the Caribbean with cottages with snow and a robin redbreast on the post outside. So you are pretty certain that what you're coming to is a cottage with snow and a robin redbreast. Yeah. So most of us were pretty, exactly. Most of us were pretty jolly shocked when we came along to these terraced houses, and we thought people were putting us in factories. I mean, that's a very, very common theme amongst folks who came from the Caribbean and elsewhere during that time. So it's a bit of a shock in terms of geography. And even though many of our homes were small, some were quite big, they were always detached. So you never lived, next to somebody else's house.
Yeah. Now, swinging, so you came in what, the 60s? Yeah.
1960.
So 1960. We're just coming up. Well, that just precedes the Beatles and Carnaby Street and swinging 60s and dedicated followers of fashion. There was
Jimi Hendrix.
Oh, Jimmy, yes. It was. He was a paratrooper in the Screaming Eagles, the 101 Airborne.
All right.
He was in the same regiment that landed at D-Day. Yeah, you can't. Yeah, I know. There you go. That's my Jimi Hendrix knowledge for you.
Yeah, didn't know that.
I know I've got some guitars on the wall, but I'm gonna resist the temptation.
I see them.
Back then in London in the 60s, despite all the glamour and all the fashionable with it, there was blatant discrimination. I can remember as a kid on a bus in London, I could see in signs in windows that said no Irish, no dogs, and if people were being particularly restrained, no blacks. Is that how it was for you and your family?
Yeah, I never saw any of those signs, but I knew they existed. And so many of us encountered and negotiated with subtle and blatant racism and otherness. We didn't use the word racism so much back then, did we? Otherness, colored prejudice would be the kind of idiom.
Yeah.
We experienced it in different ways, didn't we? So for me, it was as a child of 8 into my first 3 years, curiosity. Your hair is different and people are playing around with your woolly hair. Or the incredibly mysterious reality that I've got 2 friends. One is Errol, he's black. I go in and out of his house. My other friend is called Martin, he's white. I never get past the threshold of his house, his post-war prefab house. I never get past the threshold, and I never know why. And I think the prevailing experience for those of us who were children, weren't looking for jobs, weren't out hunting for accommodation. Our parents weren't to those kind of things. For us, it was just the bewilderment of being different and trying to survive the average school day without being laughed at because of the way you sounded or you didn't know what other people knew and so on. So it was a scaled down kind of discrimination, which was nonetheless just as real and very powerful.
So it's almost like a background radiation, isn't it? It's just there. That's the kind of atmosphere you're living in of this being other.
Yeah, it's background and it's foreground and it surrounds you. It's more like surround sound, Nigel.
Come to that later on. Now, since the death in America of George Floyd, games on the likes of Match of the Day, and again, football has been one arena where there's been persistent racism and racial abuse. Players have been taking a knee to show solidarity with Black Lives Matter. A commentator will typically say something like, this continuing message, this is that there's no room for racism. Now, today's reports in the newspaper and on the TV of Meghan and Harry are saying that racism was a family in them feeling that there was no room for them in the UK. And Meghan said there's a difference between being rude to somebody and being racist. How do you find racism and somebody being racist?
Yeah, I think that is a really important issue. And the distinction which Meghan was attempting to make is extremely important. And it gets us into all kinds of very complex conversations, doesn't it? Because I think if, as a Black person, every hostility I experience from a person who is white, if I interpret that as inevitably racist, then my whole life becomes one long, tedious, impossible, polemic existence. I just can't afford that kind of energy. So if you're a Black person, you do have to be discriminating. When is somebody rude? When is somebody gotten out the wrong side of the bed? When is somebody, lacking social skills? And when is somebody racist? When do you find that someone's objection to you or attitude to your professionalism undermines you constantly, more than once, more than twice, side statement, microaggression, behavior which suggests that in some way, what you say, who you are, what you do, what you eat, is inferior and somehow not quite up to British scratch, then you know you're dealing with something which is blatantly or subtly racist, and you deal with it accordingly. But for me, as a Christian, as a human being, trying to get along with other people made in God's image, I want to hear your heart, and I also want to hear your attitude. and I want us to try and get along. But there is that discernment, I think, between rudeness, as Megan was saying, and just outright racism.
You mentioned there, you likened racism, when I said it was sort of like background radiation, you said actually no, it's foreground as well, and it was like surround sound. Since you've been in this, since you've lived in London, and it's obviously nothing personal, but there have been a number of race riots. There was some before 1960. There was Notting Hill in 58, and then there's Lewisham in 77, St Paul's, Bristol, Brixton, Handsworth, Toxteth, Mothside, all in 81, Broadwater Farm, Tottenham, Chapeltown, Leeds, Dewsbury, Bradford, Oldham, Birmingham. In 2011, we had what was known as the London riots, but then they spread to the likes of Birmingham, Manchester, Leicester, and Wolverhampton, became the England riots. We do not have a very good history of welcoming people who are not white in this country, do we?
No, and it goes back much farther than that. There were riots in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. There was restlessness and hostility and a lack of welcome, which rides way back over the last 400 years. 1601, Queen Elizabeth sends out an edict for the removal of the blackamoors from the shores of Britain. There was a Mansfield trial back in 1772. The list goes on and on and on. So there has always been this real tension between people of color and other ethnicities as well, and the dominant culture. And these are issues around pigmentation, of course, but there are also issues around status, around power, around privilege, around work, and a whole plethora of issues by which the resident community perceive themselves to be squeezed out of their own kind of political and material inheritance. And so restlessness and racial tensions go back a very, very long way in this country. The kind of examples you mentioned of some of the unrests we have had in the 20th and 21st century, or 20th century at least, are the more recent ones. But yeah, it's a very long history.
Yeah. Some of those riots and disturbances came about after the deaths of Black people. Cynthia Jarrett in 85 led to the Broadwater Farm disturbances. In 93, of course, we had the tragic death of Stephen Lawrence. We then in 2000 had again the tragedy of Damilola Taylor. 2011, Mark Duggan, which again gave some people an opportunity to react. After the Stephen Lawrence death, there was the Macpherson inquiry and the Macpherson report. And one of the most damning statements there was that the Metropolitan Police were adjudged to be institutionally racist. What do you understand? Can you explain what institutional racism is, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to put those unrests and riots in context, these are always this is always the overflow of the stuff which goes on all the time. And so it reaches a boiling point at that point when somebody's dignity and humanity and life is either put at serious risk or actually snuffed out altogether from those examples you've mentioned. And then the pot boils over. My cup is full and boileth over, as it were. So this is to put those things in context. And therefore, when one talks, as Macpherson did, about institutional racism, whether you're talking about the police, or you're talking about the probation service, or you're talking about the health service, or you're talking about indeed the church, these are the traits, ways of doing things which favors the dominant and prevalent culture against minority and ethnic communities who also form a part of those institutions and communities. And it reflects in the lack of job opportunities. It reflects in the lack of promotional opportunities. It reflects again in the kind of language people use about their colleagues. It reflects in a whole plethora of ways. But basically, institutional racism is more than one or two rogue individuals calling somebody the N-word. This is the way in which the system is set up and continues to run at the disadvantage of those who are minority communities within the institutions.
In reading speaking about the dominant society, I've been reading this book, Why I Am No Longer Talking to White People About Race, by Rene Edo Lodge. The thesis here is that, as I understand it, and I might be mistaken, and please correct me if I am, the thesis is that only white people could be racist. Is that the way it is?
I don't think so myself. I think Rene Edo Lodge's book is well worth reading, and you shouldn't be misled by the title. She does talk to white folks about race.
She confesses.
Yeah, she really does. She just doesn't want to talk to people who really don't want to learn or do anything about it.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
And I think what she pulls on here is, one of the more radical propositions in the kind of scheme of critical race theory that incipiently and unavoidably and perhaps irredeemably white folks experience white privilege and power, cannot relinquish it, and therefore are always racist by definition. And the inference then, as you say, and as I think her book comes pretty close to suggesting, is that racism is therefore the province of white people over against black. I think it's true to say that that has to be the case if you're talking about communities in which whiteness is the dominant culture. If you're in the UK, if you're in Europe, if you're in America, if you are in Australia, this has to be the definition or the understanding of racism. That is the province of the dominant community. But actually, if you are Adolf Hitler in Germany and you use racial definitions by which you mark a whole race of people as subhuman and worthy of dehumanizing behavior or conditions or treatment rather, and even being murdered in the millions, then you are a racist. If you are Idi Amin and you are in charge of Uganda and you chuck out Ugandan nations, that feels to me like behavior based on race, which persecutes another group of people on the basis of their race.
So anti-Semitism is racist behavior.
I think anti-Semitism always has this multiple layer about it, isn't it? It's religious, it's racial, but certainly as far as Hitler was concerned, with the kind of beliefs which came out of sort of post-Enlightenment of the Aryan superiority and the fact that these people are held responsible for the murder of Jesus, and so on, became targets of racist victimization, racist murder. Yeah.
There is there's a perception that I want to talk about stop and search at the moment, if I may, because there's a perception, particularly in London, that this is a white privilege weapon or a white privileged approach that discriminates against Black and Asian youths in particular. But reading the Ministry of Justice figures, in 2018, the number of Black men who were stopped and searched, the percentage of all the stop and searches, Black men equals the same percentage as white men. So according to the Ministry of Justice figures, it is the same number. However, if you're a Black man in London and you're stopped and searched, you are 25, the chances of you being then arrested are something like 1 in 4. 25%. If you're a non-Black man, you're white, Asian, Chinese, your chances of then getting arrested are somewhere between 6 and 13%. In other words, as a Black lad in London, you are between 2 and 4 times more likely to be arrested if you're stop and searched than if you're not black. Is that an example of institutional racism?
It's an example of institutional racism, but it's also an example of attitudes which the police bring to their job. So my son is a detective inspector in the Metropolitan Police. He's in his 20th year. And if you talk to him about stop and search, he will say, yep, it is a necessary evil. And he will say that 2 things apply. One is the attitude of young men or women when they're stopped, which may exacerbate certain responses from the police. And secondly, what kind of attitudes a white police officer takes to a black young man or woman who has been stopped and searched. So I think what the evidence suggests, and we need to remember that the percentages and the proportionality over the last 20 years goes up and down all the time. It shifts and it changes, it varies in areas and so forth. But I think there's nobody I have come across, black or white, who suggests that stop and search is unnecessary and should be done away with. It's obviously a very important tool in the police's toolkit. And therefore, if you talk to someone like Leroy Logan, who's a good friend and on the news very often, Leroy would suggest that a part of what is needed here is attitudinal education for police officers in how they treat black young men when they meet them on the streets. Another ex-police officer, John Sutherland, another good friend, would also say exactly the same thing. So I think we are looking at attitudes even more so than getting into the politicized language of institutional racism. It may well be that. It may be a very good handle to put on the behavior we're seeing. But I think what it really comes down to, all the evidence would suggest, is that if attitudes are different, very often the outcomes can also be different. But this disproportionality screams out that something is terribly wrong in the way this is executed.
Yeah, indeed. We said earlier there that England has quite a sad history of race riots, disturbances, brought about by an unwelcoming attitude. To what extent is a Christian justified in taking part in an act of violence for the sake of, for a human rights issue? Or, as you say, the tensions boil up and this is what you get, and it shouldn't really come as a surprise that people are upset.
Yeah, I once heard Trevor Noah, the black comedian, South African comedian in the States, just after the George Floyd thing, give a really superb analysis of the whole, place of violence in racial injustice. And the way he put it was very helpful. He said, look, if there's a social contract which black people have with institutions, and they do their bit to try and be law-abiding, and it appears that the others aren't doing their bit. If you're kneeling on a person's neck for over 8 minutes and you kill someone, it means that you're not abiding by the social contract, by the deal. And so it's not surprising, therefore, when violence erupts. So I think from a Christian perspective, you never excuse violence, but neither should you proportion all the responsibility for violent outbreaks on those who have been the victims of discrimination and racism and injustices. And so there is an equal measure of responsibility in those of us who govern to do so justly, to do so fairly, to do so transparently, for those who govern to listen and be attentive to the cries of those who are being victimized on a regular basis, and therefore to recognize that there comes a point in which your breaking of the social contract may precipitate violence. And the other thing to say is this, that I think from a Christian point of view, we're always very nervous about the relationship between violence when it occurs and righteousness, if you like. But hey, one of the most violent things which accompanies prophetic movement, can well be associated with the Reformation. You cannot disassociate the peasants' riots for Martin Luther's claim of being justified by faith and being set free from the oppression of the Catholic Church of his day. And so the responsibility as a Christian for the avoidance of violence always has to be seen as a two-way street. You just can't blame the guys and the girls on the streets. You have to begin by examining the responsibility which Parliament and the movers and shakers and the informers and the media and those who are, responsible for civil order also have in this whole drama, this dance of violence, non-violence. We still celebrate Martin Luther King. It's still the best way to do it, but it doesn't always happen that way.
But I wonder if you're suggesting there that when police and the authorities at a time of tension speak to what they call community leaders, which often involves pastors and imams and so on, whether you're actually giving a sort of a justification, a rationale. I mean, what does a pastor? I mean, you're a pastor. You've been a pastor. What do you say to people who look to you, Pastor Joel? Should we be going out and putting up the barricades? Should we? This isn't fair. They killed my mate. What do you say as a pastor?
I think there are more than one ways of identifying with those who are expressing their grief and anger against injustice in violent ways. I would never advocate that, let's stop the prayer meeting and go chuck some bricks. That wouldn't be very good pastoral advice or even civil advice, would it?
Yeah.
But I think we can say, in the pain of those who are overflowing with violence, we have a responsibility first to acknowledge what their story is, to offer them another way of expressing their frustrations, to use the political processes perhaps more effectively, and to still advocate peaceful civil response to injustice. That's always going to be our way forward. What I'm saying is, when violence occurs, we don't just stand back and blame one side of the discourse and exonerate. So my earpiece keeps coming out, and exonerates the other. There's a very powerful story in Birmingham some years ago when one of the riots broke out. Some folks were in prayer meeting. And when the riots began just outside the church doors, what happened was the prayer meeting stopped. The older folks inside the church went outside. And when they saw what was happening, you know what they did? They actually apologized to their children who had been complaining for a long time about police behavior. Because for the first time, they saw their children being handcuffed, roughed up, children they knew who were not violent people. And more than that, some of those who came out of the prayer meeting to stand on the streets also found themselves being roughed up and handcuffed by the police. And for the first time, that church said, okay, we think we understand better what's happening now. They changed their attitudes, provided training, legal advice for the kids, made just a massive difference. So I'm saying, there's more than one kind of responsibility which we have as a Christian community.
Joel, we've talked a lot there in the last 10, 20 minutes or so about things of the head, about practical things. But tell me, what does racism feel like?
Racism feels like your value as a human being is being expunged, that your dignity is being cancelled by another person, that you are being othered to such an extent that you are expected to look up at your oppressor rather than look them in the eye as a fellow human being. It feels like your soul is being desecrated. And I say that to someone who has one of the more positive stories about the experience of racism. So although I have experienced in the last 60 years or so in this country, a great deal of passive stuff. The kind of really aggressive, I can count maybe 2 or 3 occasions where I feel I've really been treated aggressively in terms of racist behavior. And I can only imagine, therefore, if my experience, which is fairly diminutive compared with many others, if my experience feels like so much of a diminishing of my humanity, what it must therefore feel like for a 25-year-old who is stopped systematically on the streets or in her car because it's a decent car, or somebody who is not allowed promotion or whatever.
Yeah. Thank you. Black Lives Matter movement came to prominence in this country with the death of George Floyd, and we've seen as a consequence of that the statue of slave traders being shoved into Bristol docks. There's been great debates in certain council chambers, or at least virtual council chambers, about other monuments and whether place names and street names should be changed. How did the Black Lives Matter movement come about? Where does it fit in the spectrum of other anti-racism campaigns? And how helpful is it for white Britain to be thinking about the empire past, the slave past, and how helpful is it to take down statues of the likes of Rhodes or Colston and to be changing street names?
The Black Lives Matter movement has been quite phenomenal. It's less than 10 years old. 2013, I think it came about for the death of a black person in the States, and was beavering away, being quite strategic in its momentum. And then obviously it was ignited by George Floyd, as we all know, last year. And it now commands a tremendous amount of respect, as we all know, with epicenters in the States, in Canada, and increasingly here in the UK. And there are different expressions, therefore. And it's not seeking to be a political movement, as I understand it, but certainly seeking to exercise significant political influence in the decolonizing of white power, white privilege, white supremacy would be its mantra. Well, not everyone is enamored by the Black Lives Matters movement. Not all black people are pro-Black lives. I would say that it asks a great deal of very important questions. And I'm slightly dismayed when, white leaders, Christian or otherwise, say we want nothing to do with it in any shape or form. It's got nothing to offer. I don't think so. It's asking critical question about policing. And I wouldn't go along with the defunding of the police. But I do think there is something to be said for an argument which asks, how do we begin to revise and reconsider the establishment of a police force in the US? Doesn't apply in the same way here. A police force which was set up historically to hunt down, recapture black slaves. That was its genesis in the States. Yeah. And if that's the genesis, that's worth a discussion. That's worth asking, what's the proportionality of funds which should go to the police? Or are there creative ways in which we, not get rid of the police service, I think that's going far too far, but to have creative conversations about how resources are used in other ways which may be more creative, by which police may not always be at the forefront. Do police have to show up with guns every time there is some kind of unrest? Or are there other ways in which resources can go into communities for the community's well-being? So I think it raises some very helpful and critical questions. And, as I often say to friends, if the devil himself showed up and said to me, Black Lives Matter, I would say, yes, I agree, but it doesn't mean I'm following him to hell. And neither would I go with everything the Black Lives Matter says. Its belief in intersectionality isn't necessarily the way I would come at the issues of identity politics, for example, as a Christian believer. But nonetheless, I would want to continue asking those critical questions about the relationship between being a black woman, a single parent black woman, an unemployed single parent black woman. These issues, these areas of human struggle which intersect are worthy of serious consideration. So I think they offer some good questions. They don't hold all the solutions. Pulling down statues, come on, let's be more discriminate. Let's think it through. Edward Colson was not something done in the name of black people. Go back, have a look at the clips. The people who rolled the statue in the harbor were not black folk. They were white people. And so we also need to ensure that we come back to those questions with real intelligence, as well as a sense of urgency, I think.
Well, our question tonight is which lives matter? So come on, what's the answer? Which lives matter, Joel?
You know, as the great thing about the Christian faith, which is what we celebrate, is that from the womb to the tomb and beyond, all lives matter all the time. And the amazing thing about the Christian faith is that we don't just celebrate the importance of all lives, people made in God's image here on the planet, but we actually feel that life matters even more beyond this one. So, you know, we've got a 360-degree appreciation for the value of life. But when we say Black Lives Matter, that, I think, is a necessary, time-bound political recognition of the fact that there has been an imbalance in the injustices experienced by a lot of Black people. And for now, it is right to superimpose this emphasis on the value of all lives, all people made in God's image. But for now, it is right that the Black Lives Matter movement reminds us that there is what Martin Luther King would call the fierce urgency of the now in relation to issues of racial justice, not just here in the UK, not just in America, right around the world, as we saw from the demonstrations during last summer.
Yeah. Joel, as you might imagine, our viewers are rolling their questions in. I'm going to come to them in a minute. One last question from me then before we do. You've mentioned the Christian faith quite a lot tonight. You've mentioned the Bible, but how has the Bible hasn't always been used in the right way. In fact, President Trump himself was criticized for clearing the streets after a protest in the States last year and standing outside a church with the Bible. How has the Bible itself been misused to promote white privilege or to justify slavery, promote a racial segregation, and to condone racism?
It's been used very effectively.
So used or misused?
Misused very effectively to do precisely that. So as we know well, don't we, slaves are taught to obey their masters. Back at the height of slavery, the reference in Acts 17 that God has put parameters around different and boundaries around different peoples so that each should stay within their boundary was used by apartheid South Africa. And so we could go on. The truth of the matter, of course, is that the Bible gives precisely the opposite message, read authentically and read well. It begins with this assertion, the very opening sections of the book, that everyone is made in the image of God. And therefore, that is the starting point, if you like, for a Christian anthropology. And this Exodus event, which means that God, the liberator, is always on the side of the oppressed, is very, very strong in the Caribbean, in the Americas, in the 18th, 19th century, and a lot of the revolts, the Sham Sharp riots of 1834, is about the fact that this God, who is the liberator, comes to us in the Bible to tell us the story of liberation, which of course is why the slave masters don't want Black slaves to read the Bible. So yeah, the Bible is extremely affirming of everybody made in God's image, but somehow in the kind of 1600s into 1900, beginning of the 20th century, during that period of Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment, when slavery became a commercial product, the Bible became one of the principal tools by which to subjugate Black people and slaves. When the Bible talks about and admits the reality of slavery, even within itself and servitude, it has a much more humane response. And it has nothing to do with color, and that's really, really very different.
Thank you. Well, speaking of colour and the Bible, then here's a question from one of our viewers tonight, and the question is very simply: is it racist to portray Jesus as white?
Oh man, that's, you see where this word racist gets just wheeled all over the place in ways which for me becomes very secondary. To portray Jesus as white is highly irresponsible. It's hermeneutically crazy. It's ethnologically mad. And the result is racism. So to declare God or Jesus as white is the product of irresponsible behavior, which turns out to be racist. But racism isn't necessarily the driving force behind this madness of declaring God to be white or Jesus to be white. It's the end product of theological foolishness.
Which one person from history, asks a viewer tonight, distant past or more recent, do you most admire and why? I mean, you've mentioned Martin Luther, as tonight. So is he a hero, or is there somebody else?
Yeah, I'd have to go back to Martin Luther King Jr., I think. When I was a kid, this is the first Black man who I ever experienced harmonizing preaching with political action, when for me as a kid in my teenage years and early 20s, and in the context of a kind of a Pentecostal holiness tradition, you didn't mix politics and the pulpit at all. They had nothing to do with each other. Here was a man, erudite, philosopher, theologian, civil activist, courageous, which shone out above everything else, who said to me as a young Black kid in a school of 1,200 boys, where I was one of maybe 5 Black boys, maybe one of 3 Christians, you can be Black, Christian, intelligent, and politically active. It was liberation for me.
Yeah. A lady's contacted us. She says, as a white female in the UK, I am part of the dominant culture. Is there a way I can avoid being subconsciously racist?
Yeah, I would say, you can't avoid being subconsciously preferential for your race. Whether that makes you therefore subconsciously a racist is a conversation which we're still having, I think. And so I'm not necessarily of the school of thought which says that every white person, because of their preferential dominant culture, is therefore by definition racist. I would say you have racist potential. I would say if you allow yourself to be unguarded, yes, you could easily slip into behavior which expresses racial preferences to the detriment of people of color. Definitely possible. But I don't think it means that you are irredeemably a racist because you are white. That's not my personal position.
So just to draw sort of a parallel here, is it possible, say, to be a Spurs fan without dissing the Arsenal?
I'm sure it is. I'm not sure I don't want to draw those parallels because, the preference of sport. However, I know sport, and especially football, is a little bit of a religion around the world. It's not one I necessarily subscribe to either. But I think to make those parallels where one has this element of choice about your team is not the same as how you are born, either white or Black. And the very deep influences which go into you from schooling, from what you watch on TV, from what your parents tell you, which can make you predisposed to discriminate against another human being on the basis of their color. So I think you may have a predisposition, doesn't mean you are automatically and forever and irredeemably racist. I think that lacks redemption, and I'm a Christian.
Yeah. somebody asked last week, actually, I was having a conversation about wholeness and healing, but actually this questioner brings it into the area of racial injustice, and the question is, can the church be involved in bringing healing to the community for racial injustices that have happened over many hundreds of years?
Yes, I think so, and I think this is a glorious opportunity for us to pause and to do that. And to my mind, Nigel, step one is a recognition of the church's complicity in the development of the concept of race and racism. So when people use the Bible to perpetrate ideas like the curse of Ham, which is a ridiculous idea because the curse was Canaan, the son of Ham, and then produce ingeniously ridiculous excuses or reasons for that, or somebody like Immanuel Kant, who begins the idea of white supremacy by his own kind of anthropology, and the church sanctifies and curates racism, and then uses this idea of race and racism to justify slavery and export that through missionary enterprise over 200, 300, 400 years. The first step is to say, wow, if we've been responsible or involved in the curating of race, let's acknowledge that. Let's begin to unlearn some things. And then let's begin to ask, how do we truly recognize other people made in God's image and exercise a biblical approach to reconciliation, which is about a change of mind, a change of power structures, a change of attitudes, which honors difference, even if it might cost me to do that in the process, because it's going to. If the dominant culture is to be more than a passive host of other people's gifts, then it has to give something away at some point as well, because Black folks, Asian folks are always giving lots and lots away to the dominant culture.
Yeah. On the subject of the Bible, quite a few people are asking along the lines of, is the Bible pro or anti-racism? Why are there exact instructions in the Bible on how to treat slaves, including how much you can beat them? I must confess, I don't remember the instructions on beating slaves, but you've got the doctorate. What's the answer?
Yeah, I didn't read that passage either on beating
Fair enough.
slaves.
So, is the Bible pro or anti-racist? And what are the exact instructions in the Bible on how to treat slaves?
Yeah, I don't think the Bible engages in racism or racist ideology. The Bible doesn't even use the idea of race. I think the NIV, the New International Version, uses the word race, and one of the passages in Romans, I think Romans 10 or somewhere, that's a mistranslation. The Bible talks about ethnicity. It recognizes differences of religion and culture and dynasties. It does not differentiate on the basis of race anywhere in the scripture. That's a late Enlightenment imposition on the scriptures. And I think we have to liberate ourselves from that. In terms of slavery, slavery has been around since the dawn of human creation. The Bible acknowledges that the very temple in Jerusalem, in Solomon's temple, was built through slavery. So it's never run away from that. What we read and what we come across in the New Testament response to slaves and slavery is, I think, an incendiary device at the very root of the establishment of slaves. Onesimus, the slave, Paul calls his brother. Treat him like a brother. Rich and poor, noble and low, are brought together in a union with Christ, by which we are in a level playing field. And so there's already the seeds of destruction in the system of slavery built into the Christian faith.
Thank you. I'm just hearing in my ear, or at least seeing on my screen, there is a reference in Exodus 21. So we're getting educated tonight, Joel. Every day's a school day, you know. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. That is Exodus 21, 20, and 21. Thank you.
Stand corrected. I thought we were talking about the New Testament instructions on slavery. And even here, that reference still expresses a more humane response to the issue of beating than other civilizations would have had.
Sure. You say there that the Bible doesn't contain the concept of race apart from a mistranslation. One of our viewers tonight asks, what are your thoughts about the whole idea of race? Are there different races, or are we just the human race?
Yeah, I think this once again, it's a hugely important debate. So the construct of race, and with it whiteness, is a very late idea. It comes out of post-Enlightenment, the new science, the need to differentiate different people typology and people groups on the basis of ethnicity, culture, language, and so on, and therefore the concept of race comes out from that. I think in our modern parlance, we might say that there are different races of people, but we needn't go as far as saying, yes, racism is therefore a requirement of recognizing that there are different typologies. So I think I'd still be really quite nervous to talk about races, one race, the human race, certainly different typologies and expressions of groupings of people within the human race, if you like. So I'm more comfortable to talk about the human race than races.
Thank you. Should there be more done to tell the real truth about British colonialism and its impact?
Yes. And that was a good time.
Thank you. Would you like to suggest some ways?
Yeah, there's quite a lot happening, particularly in terms of school curriculum, to and you know, there's good evidence that this is coming into the school curriculums, that we hear the whole story of our colonial history, not just written from the perspective of the conquerors, not just written, not glossed over, but to hear the whole story of the subjugation of peoples in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, in Aboriginal communities, in Australia, New Zealand. Yeah. And I think we've come a long way in doing that. So it got to be in education. But I want to say this as well. That story has to be more than just the bad things done to Black and Asian people. It has to be about their dignity, their achievements, their legacy, their history. And I think that's, you know, that has to be a very important part of the educational process.
So not just a victim narrative.
Not just a victim narrative, the strong legacy of attainment, achievement, and heroes.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
That's what Black History Month is partly about, trying to do that.
Yeah. It's a shame that we should have to have a special month, isn't it? You know, it should be there every day of the year, shouldn't it?
Yeah, you know, once again, there, you know, I know some good Black folks who feel that it shouldn't be necessary at all. It's a bit of a misnomer. Yeah. I think once again, you know, you have to go out of your way sometimes, don't you, to try and rectify things. Let's hope that in another decade from now, it becomes a little bit of an anachronism because we're doing a far better job.
Yeah. Okay. 2 questions to finish with then. Lady writes in, as a young white woman growing up in the 1980s, my father told me not to be with a Black guy. I felt very frightened then, and now I feel very ashamed at this country's attitudes. What do you think is the best way forward for me out of these negative responses?
Well, you're asking the question, and I really appreciate that. And you are owning up to your own feeling of complicity within that and the possibility that there is a better way out of this. The truth of the matter is that all the signals are that that sort of attitude is way out of date. Mixed relationships are becoming almost norms, so that all the indicators suggest that in another 20 years from now, mixed race community will be far greater, if you like, than just Black communities.
Yeah.
And so we're already on this road to repairing the kind of damage which those kind of perceptions created in the past and which are still with us in some places now.
Yeah. And the last question then, Joel, thank you. It's from somebody who says, as Christians, we try to live the way Jesus taught us. How can we model better ways to living to those around us in relation to people who are different from us?
If you're a white person, try and find a way of truly, truly, truly believing that they are your equal, and that one needs one's imagination remolded and reshaped. It's a great book by a guy called Willie Jennings, Professor Willie Jennings. He talks about the Christian imagination. And the whole premise of his work, which deals with issues of the historic development of race and racism, and if you like, colorism and the imperialism which came with whiteness, is that all individuals need to reimagine the world in a way which drives towards the sense of belonging together, not just reconciliation, but that we truly belong together as one humanity. And that starts by a dynamic reimagining the possibility that all people really are equal, whatever the statistics say, whatever the institutions tell us, whatever the commercial markets suggest, we really are equal.
Thank you. My guest today has been the Reverend Dr. Joel Edwards. Thank you, Joel, so much for opening your mind, but also for opening your heart to us.
Thank you so much.